Hello, everybody, and welcome to our guest at Newslooks.com. My name is George Landreth, and I'll be talking with you about the approval ratings of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. We'll do a little deeper dive into the reasons for their decline in popularity and support. I think maybe we start off with this question: is why is Joe Biden coming in either in the low 40s or somewhere in the mid to high 30s of an approval rating or a approve of his presidency? I think there's a number of answers for this. First of all, even among folks who voted for him, in my research, it looks like there's three reasons that they base their thought pattern on. And then we'll get more into the rest of the public later. But among Democrats, one of the issues that's a problem is the increasing violence in our cities. And 39% said that was a big problem for them. And they look around and they see the defunding of the police effort. It's had a real impact on our urban centers. And President Biden and his allies and people who are perceived to be, from his party have been promoting this for months. And as a result, the problems are now being laid at their feet. And so it's been pretty catastrophic for some areas. For example, homicides are up by nearly 60% in Atlanta, 40% in Philadelphia, over 500% in Portland. Shootings have skyrocketed in New York City by nearly 65%, Los Angeles by more than 50, Chicago by about 20. All over the country, whether it's Baltimore, Detroit, St. Louis, Milwaukee, the violence has been a real issue. And so that's pulled down on his approval ratings because people vote with what they're experiencing in their life. We often say that the electorate votes their pocketbook. That's just a way of saying they vote what they're experiencing. Part of it could be pocketbook, but in this case, it's just the safety on their streets. Another issue that has been important to Democratic voters, meaning the people who are supportive of Joe Biden, is the kind of embarrassing and chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. We had, dead soldiers. We left Americans behind. None of that felt very organized, and it really was frustrating. And there was also a little bit lack of candor in some of those things. So I think people looked at that and they just felt like it was a mess. And they were expecting better. So as a result, that also weighs, if you will, on his approval rating. And then, of course, there's the situation at the U.S. border. And there you had people who were frustrated because locally you have jurisdictions within Texas. Texas, broadly speaking, is generally considered more of a red state. But there are plenty of counties in Texas that are blue counties. And some of those counties are starting to flip now because of the frustration with the serious troubles that are going on at the border and the impacts that they are having there. So that's also been an issue. But then you get to things like the economy, and this starts getting more just into this probably applies to everybody. And the three issues I just mentioned, in fact, apply to everyone as well. I don't think that other people don't look at those, but I think the statistics suggest that Democrats are a little less critical, for example, of his economic performance, but still somewhat critical. Consumer confidence is now at a 10-year low. And, these are things that matter. Again, that's that bread and butter issue where you're sitting at home and you're worried because prices are skyrocketing. Gas is more expensive. You're worried about the wintertime with more expensive fuel to heat your home and things like that. And it starts to wear on you a bit. So, normally a new president has a honeymoon period where Americans rally behind the new president. And even those who oppose them will often say, well, let's give him a chance. Let's see what he can do. And I think many Americans are now starting to question whether or not this honeymoon period needs to go on any longer because of that. And there's a lot of other issues. For example, we were promised a unifying, very mainstream presidency. That was one of the arguments that he made, was that he was going to be a unifier. And I think that was partly to, suggest that the previous president hadn't unified us. And in some regards, that was true. But the point is, he said he would unify us and that he would, me, I'm Joe Biden. When people say I'm a liberal, me, I have history with you kind of thing, assuring us that he'd be mainstream. And yet many feel that it'd be hard to imagine that if Bernie Sanders had won, what would be different, meaning what policies would be more to the left than the ones that we've seen in the first so often. So many voters feel a little misled, like, well, wait, you're not very unifying. It feels like you're dividing us on all kinds of things, and you haven't been very mainstream. I'll just give you a couple examples there. Highly controversial Marxist Treasury Department person, Ms. Amarova. She wants to take things like oil, gas. She said she wants them to go bankrupt because that will help the climate change agenda. But most Americans don't agree with them. And even John Tester, a Democratic senator, has expressed serious concerns about her outlook. She got her degree at Moscow State University. She wrote her, she hasn't given anyone a copy of her thesis, and it was on Marxism. So the point is, there's some issues there that people are going, wait a minute, she doesn't seem very mainstream. There's got to be somebody who's more mainstream. And I think that's a fair point. And then you can go to other issues like the coronavirus. He promised to crush the coronavirus, and he also promised to unite us. And he also promised that he early on said he wasn't going to have vaccine mandates, that he was going to get, but he would find ways to get the vaccine out and get it into people's arms. And I would argue that this issue has become so politicized. And in fairness, the question is, it takes two parties to do that. So I'm not saying that he's the only one, but both he and Kamala Harris, early on when they were running for office, referred to them as the Trump vaccines and said they couldn't be trusted. And then once they were elected, of course, they kind of changed their tune, but then kind of began this, kind of a little bit of maybe name calling, and anybody who was unwilling or resistant to getting a vaccine, instead of trying to convince them through persuasion, more just tried to call them names and bully them a little bit. And now we're to the point of mandates. And so you have this huge percent of the population that says, no, I don't want one. And I would argue, I raised a number of children. So my experience was, if you push children too hard, they start pushing back, particularly teenagers. And so I feel like with America, persuasion would have been a much better way to go. I think the vaccines for some people are really very helpful, and they're a godsend for many people, but not so for everyone. And if we get to the absolutely just, you look at the midterm elections coming up, and I think they suggest a number of problems for the Democrats. And I think that's the other problem the president's going to have, is early on, he had a lot of support in Congress, people who were willing to, even in very slim margin areas. He had a lot of people who were willing to vote for his agenda. But after the election in Virginia and the election in New Jersey, where you had, and even up in New York and in Seattle, where, they elected Republicans in different places in surprise results, or in some cases, elections that should have been blowouts, but were really close. I think there's a lot of Democrats in the House and in the Senate who look at that and say, wait a minute, I don't know if I want to hitch my wagon to him, because I'm up for re-election next year in 2022. And it looks to me like that's not going to work out well for me. So I think that his agenda might suffer a bit in the next year, simply because his own party might be a little less willing to walk the plank for him, because the credibility on some of these issues has slid so far. And also, in terms of just the idea of, you look at this, the stagnant kind of the economy seems to be a little bit stagnant. We've got some jobs coming in, but we also have a ton of people quitting their jobs, I think partly because of the mandate. We've gotten over the fact that people wouldn't accept a job early on because we were paying people more to not work. And that ended fairly recently, but now you have other issues. And of course, we've got out of control inflation right now. Even Larry Summers, who was Clinton's Treasury Secretary, says the inflation is a big problem and that it's going to persist. And so I think there's this disconnect where people are saying, wait a minute, I wanted leadership that seemed tuned into what was happening in my life. That's ultimately what every voter wants. voters aren't actually that partisan. Some of them are, but the reality is most Americans just want a good job. They just want to have, their life go well, and they want to, be able to get, pay the bills and raise their children. And I think people are starting to feel like this isn't going well. Also, though, internationally, if you look at some of the foreign policy and national security issues, I mentioned earlier the Afghan withdrawal, but and that of course was problematic because there's 208 aircraft, 76,000 vehicles, 6,000 weapons, 16,000 surveillance and reconnaissance tools, giving credibility to the Taliban, abandoning our NATO allies. All of that's a problem. And then you see things like with France, where they withdrew their ambassador. One of our oldest allies, an ally before we were even a nation, when we were fighting for our independence. So more than 230 years, they withdrew their ambassador because they're upset with the Biden administration, how he dealt with things. And then more recently, we've got the problem, Yemen. The Iranian-backed Houthi extremists stormed the U.S. embassy in Yemen just last week. They held 25 hostages. They took a ton of information and materials. And, this is one of the very first things Biden did was to overturn the designation that had earlier been made that the Houthis were a foreign terrorist organization. And this is how they thank him. And I think it's probably because they felt like there wasn't really much of a risk. And then this emboldens Iran. And Iran is a major threat in the region. Virtually all of Iran's neighbors are worried about Iran. Whether it's the Saudis, it doesn't, Israel. I mean, the funny thing is the Iranian regime has made allies of some nations that you wouldn't normally think would be allies, but they are because they're so worried about what they're up to. And so I think, this whole question of can we maintain peace through strength when we look so weak and ineffectual, when we've been so badly embarrassed in Afghanistan, and then basically with the Houthi extremists, essentially going to an embassy. It was actually a consulate, but a consulate is like a lesser embassy, and attacking it and overcoming it. And what was our response? A tersely worded press release and statement from the State Department saying that wasn't nice and we want you to let the people go and return our information and our stuff. Just there's something about that that I think is going to embolden the Iranians. And then you look at what's going on in the South China Sea with China and Taiwan, and I think it's a problem. I think they sense that this is their time to really come after America because we are now at not a state where we can be quite as strong. So the bottom line is, I think Americans see this and they're worried. And it's not a partisan issue. It's not because they dislike Democrats or they love Republicans or anything. It's just a function of Americans want a good life. They want national security. They want opportunity for their children. They want to pay their bills. And so they are starting to wonder if maybe the Biden administration isn't up to the task, and that's why their numbers have been dropping. Thank you for watching. It's been great to have this conversation with you. Don't forget to like our channel and don't forget to subscribe to it as well. We will always be bringing you the very best content. Also, don't forget to visit our website, newslooks.com. You can find the latest news, the very best opinion. It's all there. My name is George Landreth. We really appreciate the time you've spent with us, and we will see you again in the near future.